the effect has nothing to do with exactly the score? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're asking a great question, and I'm going to hold off for 2 slides because I'm going to get to your point in 2 slides, which is what you're saying, if I'm understanding, is saying, look, we're estimating an effect at this score. But if you're saying if we were in the top 1% up here, could the effect differ? And we'll come to that in 2 slides. So that's a very important limitation of this method. With all the methods we go through, we're going to talk about the strengths of the method and the limitations, and the point you're raising is one of the core limitations of regression discontinuity methods. Was your hand up? Yeah. Yeah, so when I'm saying significant, I mean statistically significant. So basically, it's a statistically significant effect. So your point is that even meaningful sort of in someone's life or something like that? So it's a good question. The literature on education and earnings, there are different estimates out there. There's some estimates that a year of schooling may increase earnings by roughly 10%. It depends on the estimates. It could be 8%, 6%, 12%, let's say roughly 10%. So if we think that the effect of a fraction of a year is sort of linear, then maybe this 0.19 years of schooling on average would increase earnings for these girls by about 2%. So it's just a question of what that means. Obviously, 2% isn't huge, but over lifetime, it's something. So I think this kind of magnitude effect in terms of schooling would be something that people would see as kind of a small but meaningful, but not huge for sure. If the program increased schooling by half a year on average, then it starts getting to the point where it feels very big. But you're right that we should have questions about the magnitude. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mean between treatment and control, or? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. So it's an interesting point that we can't, with this sort of approach, and it gets back to the point that was raised before, we can't distinguish between the effect of getting the money for the people up here and the effect of getting the money for the people here, and then again, the one that we can actually estimate. And so it could be different in those other ranges, but we can only really estimate it at the threshold because that's where we have this sharp effect. So again, this is the limitation. The critique of a lot of regression discontinuity methods is they're highly localized. They're at a very specific threshold. That's where you can estimate. So you guys are putting your finger on the right points. Okay, so again, beyond test scores, these methods can be applied more broadly. What I want to do is tie in regression discontinuity to the kinds of regression equations we've had before. So this is a slide I put up 3 or 4 times now. This is just the sort of quantification of omitted variable bias slide that we went through before we had an experiment. So that equation 2 there on the bottom says the difference between 2 groups is the true effect plus any omitted variable bias. Now, to sort of operationalize this, and again, imagine the kind of limit case where we have tons of data, and we really do have a lot of data on people just above the threshold and just below the threshold. So like the ideal case for regression discontinuity. What we might want to do is compare outcomes. So here, years of schooling, Y, for people who just barely won to people who just barely lost, let's just say. And so we're going to call those the near winners and the near losers, just like I had on the slide. And we're saying the difference between them is the true effect of getting the scholarship plus this bias term. Any difference, say, in their unobservables among the near winners and the near losers. So as your test score gets a little higher, you're a little different. Maybe your family background's a little different. Maybe you're a little smarter. Maybe you're a little more hardworking. Whatever the difference is, there's going to be a little bit of a difference between these 2 groups. The key assumption underlying all regression discontinuity approaches is that any change in those unobservables at the threshold doesn't jump. So the treatment jumps. You get the $38. You get this huge cash transfer right at the threshold, but nothing else jumps right at the threshold. Everything else is smooth. So for people that are used to kind of epsilon delta arguments from math, or thinking about continuity, if there's a tiny change in a smooth variable, so that's our x, the unobservable as the test score increases. As the test score increases a tiny bit, we don't expect unobservables to change very much if they're moving smoothly at the threshold. Okay, this is really just an intuitive argument rather than sort of a formal proof. Where we would run into trouble is if something else jumps at the threshold. So imagine there were 5 other government programs that also gave some sort of assistance to people right at the threshold. That's like the most extreme case where this breaks down. So yes, you get a scholarship at the threshold, but you also get 5 other things. You get cash support, you get a well built on your property, whatever sort of government support. Then we can't interpret the jump at the threshold as just being the result of the scholarship program. It's the result of the scholarship and everything else. But if there's no reason that anything else would jump at the threshold, then people who are right near that threshold are just basically observationally equivalent. That's the idea. Okay, so if we were to try to formalize this, then we would say, look, the near winners and the near losers differ in their unobservable by some small amount delta. They're right around the threshold. There's some epsilon difference in their test score right around the threshold, and that leads to some tiny difference in unobservables x. So what we're getting from this difference is the true effect plus c times something tiny, which is basically just the true effect. Let me pause for a second. Yeah. If we could observe x. So the problem again here is x is our unobservable, but conceptually, if you want to say like how much does the unobservable move right across the threshold, that's one way. The way you're thinking of it is one way to think about it. So as long as that is really small, because this is a continuously varying unobservable, then across this tiny threshold, this is going to be very small. Yeah, because we can't see the unobservable. So that's the issue with this method is it feels a little bit like difference in differences where we can't fully prove that there are common parallel trends, let's say. So in this case, we have to make the case that it's a plausible assumption. Yeah, Martin. Potentially. And that's where the regression adjustment comes in. And so even though we can't observe all these unobservables, we can say, look, we know there's this kind of underlying relationship. So we want to account for it with regressions because that's picking up anything that's changing as the test score changes. So that's the idea behind the regression controls to some extent, is to try to capture this using a proxy, which is the underlying test score. But that's right. You might be slightly biased, but again, if you have a lot of data right near this threshold, probably that bias is very small. Can people think, other than my government programs case, can people think of other cases where comparing across a threshold might not be ideal, where you might not get valid answers using regression discontinuity design? There's a couple of cases that are very important with public programs in particular. Yeah, in the back. Yeah, so that's a really good example. So we already had this sort of age 65 effect. So there you get not just Medicare, but you get Social Security. So that's the case where you do get sort of multiple programs, at the same time. Maybe you get a pension, maybe you get other things. So we can't just say it's the effect of Medicare. Yeah, Martin? Yeah, so it's not just, it's a little bit like this effect of being a near loser has its own effect. So there's the issue of demoralization or being a near loser. That's another one. The 65 case is really interesting. So, and this gets at the key concern people have with regression discontinuity designs beyond the local treatment effect issue, which has been brought up a few times, are issues of manipulation. And let me explain. There's many ways that scores can be manipulated. So the case of Medicare and Social Security is a good one. So if you compare how much healthcare I consume at 64 years and 11 months to 65 years and 0 months, right when I turn 65, there's a manipulation issue. It's a little bit like the demoralization issue. So think about it. I need a procedure. I tore a ligament in my shoulder, say. I need to get surgery. I tore it when I was 64 and a half, let's say. I may just wait a few months and then not have to pay for it when I turn 65, right? People do this all the time. Your guys' parents are younger than mine. People delay until they turn 65 because then they get free healthcare, and that's just the way it works. So you might see a dip, and you see this in the data. You might see a decline in the amount of medical spending, procedures, treatments before 65. And that decline feels a lot like the effect that was hypothesized before, that if you're like a near loser or you're just about to get care, that in itself changes your behavior. In other words, if I can substitute medical care over time, I may reduce my spending at 64 and a half and 64 and 9 months and 64 and 11 months, and then boost it a lot at 65. That would actually lead us to overstate the effect of Medicare. Because if there were no Medicare, I probably would have gotten my shoulder fixed at 64 instead of at 65, right? That's manipulation. That means the effect across the discontinuity is telling us a combination of two things. So that's one issue. The second issue people talk about relates to eligibility for public programs. What's one obvious thing you'd be concerned about when, say, being below the poverty line gets you certain programs? The example that was given before. Yeah. Exactly. If you're somewhere near there, you would have, and you knew about it, and you understood that I was below the poverty line, I got all these benefits, you would have an incentive to hide some of your pay from the government so you could qualify. So let's say I had a small business and I wasn't earning too much. I might try to get paid in cash sometimes and not report some of those earnings, so I'd stay just below the poverty line. And so if there's that kind of manipulation, then actually the running variable, the eligibility variable, is mismeasured. And if it's mismeasured such that very savvy, clever people who understand the rules, understand how to manipulate the rules, are just eligible, are just on that side of the threshold, they may not look anything like the people who are a little richer, say. You'd have systematic manipulation. There's a ton of this that goes on. When people measure the characteristics of people who get government programs in many less developed countries, you find evidence for manipulation. There was a student of ours here who finished maybe like 5 years ago who looked at a program not in Africa but in Latin America, in Colombia, for eligibility for a government healthcare program for the poor, and basically found that certain surveyors figured out exactly what type of survey to fill in, like what you had to answer to just barely qualify, so it wouldn't look suspicious. And they administered that exact survey. They basically told you, look, let me fill it in for you. I promise you're going to get health insurance. And they filled in the same survey thousands of times. So there's a huge, if we go back to our example, our graphical example here, this is a little bit messy, but what you would see, let me actually just go to the end. If the threshold is here, one way people gauge manipulation is they look at the density, meaning the number of people at different points with this running variable x, the eligibility variable. So this program in Colombia, if you were just poor enough, you got healthcare. So what she sees is this huge spike in density right there, like right below the threshold. And in more reliable data from other surveys that were not eligibility surveys for healthcare, really the data looks something like that. So this is where we're concerned about regression discontinuity. If you can somehow manipulate your score, that would be a problem. Now in the case of test scores, what is the type of manipulation you would be concerned about? Cheating. Like if somehow people knew they needed a certain score to qualify for something, you'd be afraid there'd be a strong incentive to cheat. Now remember, in the case of the Girls Scholarship Program, no one knew what the threshold was. There wasn't one score. It was a new program. Plus, it was a program that was administered, the tests were administered and graded basically with NGO involvement to make sure that teachers didn't basically manipulate the tests. But in other cases, if the teachers are grading them themselves, they may kind of manipulate them. So this is something we're concerned about. When we talk about the Kenya project, Lucas and BT, that I'll get to, that paper, let's come back to this and see if you guys think this is a concern. They argue it isn't, but why don't we think about it? Okay, I'm going to go back a bunch of slides. Sorry, you got all that? Got all that? Got that? Okay, awesome. Okay, limitation. So that's one limitation. There could be manipulation. Another limitation is what you guys have already come up with, which is our d effects are really localized. We're getting at the effect at the threshold. Maybe the effect would be different at the top or at the bottom. And in some cases, that's pretty important. So in the case of Girls Scholarship Program, we're estimating the effect at the cutoff for the top 15% of girls. Now it turns out, once you're in the top 15%, you're in that range, most of those girls were going on to high school anyway. They weren't the most downtrodden. I already told you last time their parents had more years of schooling on average, they had pretty good test scores, they were going to go on for more schooling. Sure, they were from a poor rural area, but they weren't the absolute poorest. We may actually be more interested in the effect of paying for school fees and giving a scholarship for the girls down here. This may be the more sort of progressive, redistributive policy. If we really want to help the people that really lack funding and lack the ability to go to school, maybe we want to know what the effect is there. But this threshold isn't going to tell us that. We can't get at that with this data. So that's the limitation of the regression discontinuity. The only way you could do this would be by having a series of experiments, regression discontinuity experiments, with different thresholds. So in one population, we'd set the threshold here, and then in another population, we'd set the threshold here, another population, we'd set the threshold here, etc. That'd be the only way that we could do that. Jan? Yeah, it could if they were all those thresholds were somehow offered in the same population. So we'd have to have sort of one separate population with one threshold, another population with another, so that they don't sort of, so you're only competing at a certain threshold level with a fixed population. And then the sample size needs and the financial needs to run that experiment would get really huge. Yeah. 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 Different papers do different things. The paper we're going to talk about next excludes some of the most extreme ones, so they create a window, but it's a pretty broad window, and then they do regression controls within that window. So people kind of do both. Now others are purists and say we're going to use all the data and just control flexibly with regressions on all the data. But if you have sufficient sample, you don't lose much by restricting to a narrow window because you have pretty precise estimates. So that's the typical thing to do is narrow the window enough so you have a sample with pretty precise estimates, and then do some simple regression adjustment. That's what most people do, sort of in applied papers these days. Okay, so that was a limitation. Local effects is a limitation. Now, what I want to do now is very briefly make the distinction between the RD design with this data and the RCT design, the randomized controlled trial design, just so you guys are clear on the distinction, because I think it's a little bit confusing. The other thing we do, and I'm going to talk about it in detail next lecture, is we followed up the girls in the treatment group and the control group, all of them, winners and losers, and measure their test scores. And it turns out the girls in the treatment schools from Busia, 5 years later, still have higher test scores. How would we represent that graphically in a plot similar to what we had before, comparing GSP treatment and GSP control let's say everybody gained by 0.2 standard deviations. This is how you'd represent it. There's some baseline test score, some variation of baseline ability. If all the treatment girls did better on a test score, this plot would shift up. That's the treatment effect of treatment versus control. Whereas the regression discontinuity estimate is saying, among only the treatment students, is there a discontinuity at a certain point? Okay, that's the distinction between the two. Now, you can combine the two. You can imagine putting a discontinuity on the treatment plot here. I haven't done it here just for simplicity, to get at both treatments at once. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is just graphically what we're going to come back to. But these are two different approaches that result from the same experiment. In the Girls Scholarship Program, there was an incentive experiment in the treatment schools and not the control schools. We can study the effect of that incentive. And then there was a second treatment, which was actually giving scholarships to a subset of girls in the treatment schools. To do that, we use regression discontinuity methods. Yeah. Exactly. So the treatment effect for GSP treatment is a little hard to interpret because it's the combination of the incentive effect, any externality of that incentive on other people in the classroom, and any effect of giving out these scholarships in the treatment group. So comparing treatment versus control combines all those effects. Yeah, I just made them equal here for simplicity, just to show that an average treatment effect would kind of be a shifting of this plot as opposed to a discontinuity at a certain threshold. Yeah, but that's right. The GSP treatment effect is sort of a combination of several things. So that's exactly right. Okay, let me pause for a second and see if there's any other questions before we kind of move on to the Lucas and MDT piece. Yeah. Yeah. So what they do basically is they try to control. Let me just trace it out here. They try to control for this. See this relationship here? So in cases like this one where it's fairly linear, you might say, controlling for this linearly looks pretty good, or maybe with a quadratic is pretty good. And it just turns out that as score gets higher, you get more schooling. We don't know exactly why. We don't know all the unobservables, but this is a pretty good proxy. And if we can control for this general upward sloping relationship, we're kind of capturing most of the variation that we care about. So people will do that. Now, when people have like millions of observations, then they have the privilege of literally just restricting attention like super close to the threshold and saying like, I don't need to control for this relationship. I don't care about that relationship. I've got data on the threshold. Let's say I had 1 million observations just below the threshold, 1 million right at the threshold. It's going to be super precisely estimated. I don't need to do the regression adjustment. When you don't have as much data, people want more precise estimates, so they kind of lump more of the data in. Now there you're making an assumption, which is the assumption that we can kind of capture this trend here, this upward sloping relationship. If that makes sense. Yeah. Sure. You mean on this slide? Okay, I feel like I've confused you guys more than helped things out with this slide. So let's go back here. We're thinking about regression. We're going to think about regression discontinuities for the rest of the lecture. We're thinking about it now. Okay, for the next 30 seconds, pretend that the last hour never happened. There's no regression discontinuity. We live in a world of treatment versus control. If we just thought in that world and we ignored the regression discontinuity and winning the award, and we said, look, in treatment schools, everybody just gets higher test scores, regardless of what their baseline exam score was, it would look like this. But in reality, as you're kind of pointing to, we just pointed out that in the treatment schools, there was this threshold here, say, we might actually have a discontinuity at that threshold. So in the treatment group, the relationship is more complicated because the treatment group is basically getting two treatments: the incentive treatment up front, and then a subset gets scholarship. So comparing treatment versus control is more complicated. Okay, so this was meant to simplify, but I think maybe I could have done it a little differently. Okay. Yeah, in the back. No, the program went on in 2001 and 2002, and it ended. Yeah, so the idea, and then we'll talk about this in the next lecture, is that year when these girls were competing for the scholarship, and they ended up getting higher test scores in Busia, had some lasting effect on their learning. So for that school year, 8 months or something, they were just studying harder. Their teacher was giving them better lessons. The kids in class were trying harder, asking more questions, whatever, and they learned more. And it turns out 5 years later, they still do better on tests. There was just some gain in skill that was more persistent. That was the idea. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You're saying could you do a diff and diff? You could. So you're saying do a diff and diff with the scholarship winners and losers? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you could do a diff and diff if you had a test score before this test score, I guess. What about the same event, the same exam? Yeah. How does that maybe have more effect, I don't know, within 2 years after the exam than after? It could. No, that's right. So for us, and I'm going to tie the bow on this discussion and move on to something else. But what we have there is basically a 5-year follow-up, and that was our follow-up. But you're right. Maybe after 2 years there's a different effect, and after 4 years or 5 years or 10 years. And very rarely do we have the data to actually monitor that. We usually have a test score at a certain point in time. And in the case of the next paper we'll discuss, we had a test score at the end of primary school, an official test score at the end of secondary school. That's all we've got. So we can't necessarily trace things out as much as we would like. Okay. Let me just give an overview of the method so far, and then turn to the Lucas and MDT piece, because we're going to apply regression discontinuity to data there in a very concrete way. The fundamental issue we're dealing with this term is omitted variable bias. We've talked about 4 ways to deal with it so far: collecting data on all the omitted variables, which is probably impossible in most cases; RCTs, difference and differences; and now regression discontinuity. You should go through and think about the advantages and the weaknesses of each of these methods. They each have strengths and weaknesses. Now, RCTs, randomized experiments, are typically thought of as